Okay, our next up is our illustrious head of Parks and Rec, Ms. Haynes, Happy Haynes, and crew, who are going to talk to us about, present to us the athletic policy and the alcohol policy in parks. 2 presentations. Welcome, Happy. Good to see you.
Fine, sunny June morning.
Fine, sunny June morning, that's right.
Good morning. I will be brief and turn it over to my team. We're going to start with an update on the athletic policy and then proceed afterwards to the alcohol policy. And I would just say not a lot substantively has changed on the athletic policy since we were here last. I think a few tweaks, sort of another round of engagement with a number of stakeholders. We provided some time for public feedback and response, so the team will walk through with you some of the, I think, pretty small changes that have occurred since the last time, and we're at the point following this to move forward with the policy.
Thank you. Hi.
Hello, everybody. Fred Weiss, Director of Finance for Parks and Recreation, and Chris Wilson, who's our permitting supervisor, who was key in this whole process, carried most of the water on this project, which I very much appreciated. Did a fabulous job. So as Happy said, when we presented 2-3 months ago, something like that, we ran through the proposed policy. Just to remind you that we did a pretty extensive stakeholder outreach. We did, I think, 4 meetings, and most of the stakeholders really are the athletic organizers. The public really, they don't have that much interest in the athletic policy because it governs the permitting of athletic fields, but we did do some outreach. And then after we came to sort of our conclusions of how the final policy should read, we actually re-engaged the stakeholder group and said, okay, this is where we landed. So we brought it full circle. General agreement with the policy on the part of the stakeholders. A couple of rough edges, but, I think that we'll be able to work through those. The only real major change or clarification from when we presented to you is really around the issue that you all brought up, which is the whole athletic priority park situation and how it at times conflicts with neighborhoods wanting to use their park.
And Madam Chair, before Fred goes on, if I may, we did have an opportunity to go through this policy with our Parks and Rec Advisory Board. We had a couple of members of the board who were participants in the process, and so they unanimously recommended moving forward with it.
Okay.
Yes, thanks. Sorry. So the resolution that we came to in terms of the issue of neighborhood organizations being able to use their parks, but they're athletic priority parks, is sort of a compromise. So what we have come up with is that, as you know, November 1st is when our event permitting opens up for the following calendar year. So what we will do is we will allow neighborhood organizations to come in on November 1st through December 31st and apply for a permit for their park. If they do that, we will remove it from the inventory of athletic availability.
Oh, okay.
That date.
That date, yes. And hopefully it's really, it's really onesie-twosies for neighborhoods. It's not really, large volumes, because large volumes might really impact the athletic use more than we expect it to. But we don't really think that's the case. It's, the neighborhood wants to have a summer barbecue or maybe 2, something like that. So if they come in between January 1st and December 31st, they will get to the front of the line. And if it will be taken out of inventory for athletics, and we will do our best to relocate that athletic group, that permit, if in fact it was permitted on that day, to another date, another location, somehow do our best to accommodate that athletic group. But that gives the neighborhood groups the opportunity to come in, get to the front of the line. Now, as of January 1st, we close that door because that's when we start really booking athletics. And the door will open up again for the neighborhood groups depending on the season. And we have a schedule of our spring season opens up on this date, fall this date, winter this date. So once we have all of the athletics booked for that season through what we call draft day, which is, okay, everybody who wants in is in. It's not the onesie twosies after. Once that happens, it opens back up to neighborhood groups or athletic groups on a first-come, first-served basis. So it gives them the opportunity to, the neighborhood groups, to come in, get in line. Now, granted, some will have, be better organized than others, and that's frankly what we're trying to encourage, is just let us know in advance and we'll take care of you, instead of the last-minute crisis kinds of conflicts and situations that we end up dealing with. And we will also do our best to possibly split days if we are able to. If we have an athletic group in the morning and there's a neighborhood group that wants to be there in the afternoon, we will do our best to split the day as long as there's a sufficient gap, and we're thinking like 2 hours between the two permits, then we will allow that to occur, because up until now it was 1 permit per day. So that's sort of the compromise that we came up with that we think will work.
And let me add, if I may, Madam Chair, so this is in addition to the accommodations that we've made for the past several years for the Denver Days
Right.
activities, which sort of puts them in the front of the line again on those for their parks and on those particular weekends. And as Fred mentioned, the idea is to give neighborhood groups a couple of bites at the apple. And it does favor those neighborhood groups that tend to be a little bit better organized and know in advance. And, you know, many of them do. They know that they're going to have an annual picnic every year. So why not get out there up front and get that settled? And for those who just suddenly figured out in May that they want to, you know, then they're free still, and this wasn't true in the past, to sign up for any of the remaining parks that have not been permitted through athletics already. So it gives a couple of different opportunities, and we think that's going to take care of 99+% of the need for the neighborhood organizations to be in their neighborhood parks.
You used to have a policy, too, sort of grandfathering people that have the same thing. Is that still in there, this grandfathered policy? And
That's for events. We don't do that for picnics and other
Go ahead, tell me.
types of
Talk
things.
a little
But
about
for
that.
neighborhood groups, if they're in there on November 1st each year for whatever, and they know for all practical purposes, it does the same thing, because they're first in line for those athletic fields.
I see, okay.
Now, it actually violates, or it trumps the athletic
Don't
priority,
use that word.
right? So, I mean, that was the compromise. It was, okay, well, we will, the neighbors need the ability to use their park. And there may be an athletic group that has historical priority for that field and that park. And if we can't make them coexist by separating out the days, we will bump them. So that was sort of the give on the athletic side.
I see, got it. Is there more? Because we do have some questions.
I think that's it. The rest of the
Okay, on
policy
this
really
piece.
remains the same.
Okay, Councilman Clark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was one of the people who was vocal about this. I had one of my neighborhoods in particular that was really impacted by the potential changes without this, and I just want to say thank you for all of your work on this, for working directly with that neighborhood in the interim to make sure that they could have these community events, but really for coming up with what I think is a really good, solid solution that, you know, respects that for the people who live here. It's hard sometimes when, you know, athletics are happening and it's not even necessarily people in that neighborhood who are in those leagues. And then once or twice a year, they want to have a movie night, and they were struggling with that in their park. So I think this is really fair and balanced, and I really appreciate the work that went into it, and I appreciate you coming to brief me on it because you knew that it was important to me, and so thank you for that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Flynn.
Thank you. Is there a written copy of it? I don't see it in our system. The policy.
It's not finalized. We have
Okay.
the outline of it.
Okay.
but The policy
When do you
is
think
not.
we'd be able to see a written copy of the draft or the policy?
When do we post for public hearing on that?
Hi, Laura Morales, Community Relations. So my guess is that we'll have that draft available to read next month. We're going to post for the public hearing at PRAB, which would be that step when we have to have it ready. So my guess is this time next month.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and I add my thanks to Councilman Clark's that, you know, I also had conflicts with the neighbors wanting it, but I want to reiterate to those watching on television, November 1st to December 31st. That is 2 months. 2 months to get your bid in, and so we're not scrambling around in May trying to find a date and a time. Thanks very much. Okay,
Thank you for that reminder to the
Sure.
public.
Yes. Thanks again to Chris and her team.
Yes,
They did an
thank you very
amazing
much.
job.
Now for the beer and
Here.
the wine and the scotch.
Pass this. Okay, the next subject is the proposed changes to our alcohol policy. This is comes as no surprise, I'm sure, to any of you, because we made the rounds and spoke to each one of you. I want to give you a little bit of background, let you know some of the details, and also Laura is going to review some of the public outreach that was done and the results of the survey. So back in, the alcohol policy was first put into place in 2007. And between then and now, it's gone through a couple of minor tweaks in terms of adding a park or adding a site, but nothing major. Given that it was really over 10 years old, we decided that it was time to sort of take a look at the policy because there have been implementation changes. The current policy is very complicated. You're able to serve certain types of alcohol at some parks and not at others, with certain permits and not at others. Some are beer and wine. Some you can do full-strength alcohol that's pre-mixed, pre-packaged. It was really very, very inconsistent. And so we felt it was time to take a look at it, and we also had some, additional requests for adding parks for various events. And so we said, okay, let's take a look at the policy. I should have probably put it towards the front, but if you turn, about 4 or 5 pages from the back, did you want to?
And while I'll just add, I think part of the impetus for this, and because we were receiving requests, including from some council members and others in the community, and when we get requests that require basically us to look at our policies by exception, then I think that stirs us to take a harder look at the policy, because we want our policies generally to guide us on a regular basis, and for exceptions to be few and not the rule. And so this is I think this was a large part of the impetus for taking a look at all of this, and then just the feedback we got from users about how complicated this process was.
So if you turn, it's like 4 pages from the back. It has some blue stripes on it. This is the document that we have been working off of in all of our outreach. It summarizes the current rule on the left column, the proposed revised rule on the right. And just to give you a context, the policy really breaks down into 3 different areas. One is permitted activity. The second is what happens in parks and recreation buildings. And the third is, what about just general public consumption in the parks, not associated with any permit? So I'll go through some of the highlights of the changes, and starting on the first page. The permitted activity, currently, it says you have to obtain a special event liquor license. For all practical purposes, that is the only license that's available to an event, because other licenses you need to prove possession for a year, and obviously no one will have possession of a park for a year other than by concession license, which is approved by council. So we would like to sort of get out of the liquor license business and say, you need to get the appropriate liquor license. Go to excise and license and get the appropriate liquor license. We would like to remove all of the distinctions and differences between what can be served in what park under what type of permit, and basically allow beer, wine, champagne, and spirituous liquor at any event as long as they get the proper licensing. And that the park will sustain and allow that type of event, which is one thing I should probably mention. All of the other rules that we have in relation to events in parks stay in place. Our rest periods, our capacities, all of the criteria that we use when somebody approaches us to want to have an event in a park, we will still go through all of those criteria and say that event, whether alcohol or not, can or cannot occur in that park. It's appropriate, it's not. Whether it's parking, whether it's too close to a street, whatever, it's too small, whatever the situation is. So we also are adding across all permits that they have to comply with a responsible vendor program, which is currently mostly TIPS, TIPS certified. Add language that the serving of alcohol needs to end a minimum of 1 hour before curfew. Actually, we're proposing to change that and say either 1 hour before the end of the event or curfew, whichever is later, so that if it's an afternoon event, they have to stop serving 1 hour before the end of the event. So those are sort of the all permit type issues. With festivals, which we now call public events, we want to remove the restriction that hard liquor has to be served in prepackaged, premixed form. We want to, again, as I said before, remove the yeah buts in terms of Sloan's Lake having special rules, Wash Park having some special rules, different places that it's written into the policy that certain areas have, certain parks have different rules. Let's see, races and walks, very similar to festivals in that not restricting the type or the quantity of events, races and walks that can occur in parks. Special occasions, removing the restrictions of the types of alcohol that can be served or sold. Event facilities, same thing, making it consistent with all of the other types of permits. One of the things that our current policy does not address are demonstration and assembly permits, which we are incorporating into this to say it is not allowed. It is inappropriate activity at a First Amendment permit, because that then crosses the line into, it's really a festival. It's not a First Amendment activity. And athletics, our current policy is silent on that, and we would like to, we're proposing to say that the sale or service of alcoholic beverages at athletic permits is prohibited except for tournaments, which are really more like events. They're 2-3 day events, so we'll treat them similar to a public event. Now, we've received a lot of questions from various people about, well, what about my beer league? What about, can I still bring beer to my softball game? We've had a lot of those questions. And what we will do, how that will be treated, it will be treated as public consumption. It is not an association with the permit. The permit does not allow serving or selling alcohol on the part of the permit holder. If a participant wants to bring an allowable alcoholic beverage, that's the guideline that will cover that. that was something very confusing to some.
And it will be permitted?
I'm sorry?
And it will be allowed?
Yes.
Well,
bring your own-
within
bring your
the
own?
public consumption, which we'll get to later,
Okay.
whatever is allowed in public consumption,
Just not for sale.
not for sale or served
Right.
by the permittee.
Right.
A person can bring it on their own.
Those are for the people who don't really care whether they win or not.
The more they drink, the more they want to win.
So that covers the permitted activity. Would you like me to go over you want me to stop now and answer questions on permitted activity, or do you want me to go through the whole
But
thing?
you go through the whole thing.
Okay, great. Parks and Rec buildings. Currently, the current policy basically says that alcoholic beverages are prohibited from all Parks and Rec buildings except, and it has a list of them. So what we're proposing to do is modify and add the list to clarify certain things, like concession licenses are in Parks and Rec buildings, and a little unclear that doesn't violate our policy. Aqua Golf Clubhouse, Harvard Golf Clubhouse, the Carla Madison Rooftop, and the Evergreen Lake House, which is really housekeeping. We just forgot about that when we wrote the policy. But we also want to add a provision that alcohol can be served at any of our rec centers if it's closed to the public. So if somebody wants to rent the rec center after hours and have a party or have some celebration, they would be allowed to have alcoholic beverages, but they could not have access to the pool or weight room for safety reasons. So that's what we're proposing for Parks and Rec buildings.
And that's generally true, by the way, with our current policy of renting those facilities after hours. We restrict access to, for obvious reasons, to the weight rooms and pools, because we do not staff, they're not there to be staffed. So they use the multipurpose areas if they're currently renting our facilities after hours.
Great, and the final is public consumption. So our current policy basically says that 3-2 beer is the only thing that's allowed to be consumed. It was written that way because that's the way state law was written. Probably back then we should have said we will follow state law, but it was academic. This document here, which was prepared a number of months ago, and we didn't want to change this document to make sure that it was consistently applied through all of our public outreach. At that time, what we said was, we will follow whatever state law is. Well, now we know what state law is. State law passed the baton to the local municipalities with regards to alcohol, what is allowed in parks. It is prohibited by state law in right-of-way, but parks said, they said local municipalities can regulate their own and promulgate their own rules. So what we are proposing is to allow beer and wine. No hard alcohol whatsoever. And this is just somebody coming in to the park, not an association with any type of event. We feel this is consistent with what's happening. We heard a lot from a lot of people that this is sort of what would be reasonable. And so that's the proposal that's on the table now.
And so it mirrors, in our view, current practice. And the recognition as we went through this process and talked to people, most people had no idea that there was actually a restriction on bringing alcohol into the park. They get reminded by our rangers, and I will add that the restriction on bottles remains in place, and that is something we do enforce. And so, if you're bringing wine, it's got to be in a box or in something else, because bottles are not allowed for under public consumption.
Now, if you,
Rules
I
should
used to
probably
call
say
headache
that,
in a
right?
box.
Yeah.
But I'm told that it's much better quality now, and so we'll
The
see.
box or
That's
the
what-
wine?
The wine.
Now, I'd like to do two other quick things, maybe one not so quick, before we open it for questions. So the last couple of pages are frequently asked questions. And those are really the result of the questions that we have been asked. And so hopefully that's helpful in answering any questions that you have. Obviously, you're open to any questions now. But for the public to be able to get answers to various questions that they've been asking. The only other thing I'd like to do is turn it over to Laura and have her go over the outreach that we've done and specifically the survey that was done regarding the change in policy.
Okay, so I'll do this very high level and quick. The first thing we did was get that not a one-pager, this blue chart out to all the RNOs and to the council members. We want to make sure people knew we were discussing this and what we had in mind. Once we got that out and we decided the best way to hear from the public would be a survey because you can hear from a greater amount of people, which we proved to happen. We heard from 4,450 people approximately in the survey that we put online. So that went out in April. We advertised that through our regular email lists, all the RNOs, Facebook, social media, all of our ActiveNet participants, people who use our recreation system, and also everyone who's had a permit of any sort in the last few years as well. So we got this out there. We heard from a lot of people. And these survey findings, unfortunately, are not very short, but it was a long survey, and we just wanted to be transparent and make sure everything we heard was out there. One thing you'll notice on the survey summary that you have is that on page 2, we did hear from more young people than not. So in order to be able to make sure that what I was seeing, and not just the overall percentages, but to make sure that I understood what each grouping of ages reported, to make sure there wasn't anything crazy that was being hidden just by doing overall and being skewed for any reason. All the charts starting on page 5 on are separated into those age groups. So blue is overall, 40 and under is orange, gray is 41 to 60, and yellow is 61 and over. So it shows that there are some differences in opinion, as we expected to see throughout the survey. However, overall, everyone is landing and pretty much agreeing with the proposed changes we have. The only time we dip slightly below is in relation to athletics, where we heard from a lot of the younger cohort that they want more alcohol at the athletic events. But we relayed some through the FAQ that it won't necessarily affect some of the things they were thinking it would. So I feel like we had a great turnout from the survey, and we learned a lot about public opinion. We learned a lot of questions, and that was what the FAQ was developed for, was any misunderstandings that we were seeing through the survey were represented there. So that went out in May with the FAQs to the same group, and we will next be doing at the same time during this whole period from February to May, we did presentations as requested to different RNOs. I think we had about 4 RNO presentations. And we also presented to INC and INC Park. The next step is a PRAB hearing, and we are posting that tomorrow. So that'll be official for July's PRAB meeting to have a public hearing.
I'm sorry, one other thing that I forgot, which is very, very important. So as part of the a couple of the neighborhood groups, there were concerns expressed in terms of the proposed changes. And so what we've decided to do is have this be a 1-year policy. It would be good to have it be a pilot, but we can't have it be a pilot because it's already a policy. So what we're proposing to do is have it sunset, have it be effective January 1st of 19 and sunset December 31st of 19. Which will force a review in the fall of 19 to see were any of the concerns valid. Did we see an increase in issues or problems that occur as a result of the policy changes? And if we do, we will revise the policy moving forward. So I think that is a good idea for us because we don't want to cause more problems. And I think it's a good idea for the neighbors in the specific parks that have some specific concerns to say, okay, let's try it for a year. And then, you know, if there are negative consequences that are significant, we will take another look and change things.
I'll add to that. I think And we had a number of agencies who worked with us every step of the way in putting this policy together and thinking through all of the issues and so on. And it was in conversation with our police chief and some of the representatives from DPD that the idea of this one-year pilot came up. Because we couldn't really answer the question about whether or not it would result in significant increases in resource demands on the part of the department or not. And so we agreed it made sense, therefore, to really review our experience under the policy in the first year. And so that's how we came to the idea of, well, let's do a pilot. And we discovered we can't really do a pilot because it's already in place. So agreed to sunset it at the end of the year. The idea being we will evaluate how the first year under the policy went, determine whether we need to make any adjustments or tweaks based on what we find, and then move forward with a more permanent policy that would take effect in January of 2020. And so that's actually, I think, a sort of compromise that really addressed some of the concerns of neighborhoods across the city, that many of whom are wary, from wary to skeptical about what will happen. And so I think they were appreciative of the fact that, we'll be informed by what actually did happen, and that we're prepared to make changes if needed as we move forward. And so I will say to you, one of the things that we will do as we finalize this policy is then determine what our sort of pre and post, what are we going to look for? What are we going to be assessing so that we're prepared at the very beginning to collect the data, and that everybody sort of is clear about what that is going into the season, and then what we'll be looking at to evaluate the process when we come out. So we'll be able to inform everyone. We'll begin to work on that soon about, so what are we going to look at? What are the questions we'll ask? How will we collect the data? And, and then in the fall, how will we engage the conversation with the community over what we have found?
Okay. Well, regulations can be changed anyway. I mean, if you found something awful happening in
Yes,
August, you'd change them right away
Policies
anyway.
can
All
change
regulations
anyway.
and
The
policy
one
can be
thing we
changed.
try to do, though, is have policies that aren't constantly changing, because people want some
Right. I
predictability,
just
they
wanted to
want
be-
some reliability. But we just think in this instance, having that 1 year
Right.
would be a good idea.
Okay, good. Councilman New.
Great. Happy, thanks for doing that one-year evaluation, because I think we had a long conversation, because I had a lot of the folks skeptical in my group, because we did a survey about, we got about 600 or 700 responses, and overall, they were in favor of the rule changes, But the thing that was so confusing for me was when we asked the question about, is this sort of a conflict with the Vision Zero of the mayor, they said yes. Did they say that would it possibly have a negative effect on the parks? And they said yes. And so this evaluation can prove whether that happens or not, which I'm glad to see. What about marijuana enforcement in the parks? Because the biggest concern everybody has, because I've had 4 DUI deaths in my district in the last 2 years, and I've got numerous DUI-related accidents. I mean, terrible accidents, going into homes, running into people's homes and yards. And a lot of it is alcohol, but also marijuana related, the combination of the two, which the police say is a problem, Are we going to be able to watch out for give closer observation to the marijuana use in the parks with especially events that serving alcohol?
A good question, Councilman New. So marijuana isn't addressed at all in the alcohol policy. Our expectation is that consumption of marijuana in public is still not legal. We will continue to enforce as we can. It is, and I will be honest with you, from the standpoint of our parks and our ability of our rangers to manage that, it isn't an aggressive enforcement because we don't have the resources to do that. And so I like to refer to both the enforcement of marijuana and alcohol, and quite frankly, a number of our other rules and regulations in parks. What I call the B and B, it is behavior. It drives a lot of our enforcement priorities. If what you're doing is leading to disruptive and negative behavior, then we're going to be on top of that, and that's where we focus our enforcement activities. And then just from a safety consideration, bottles. That's an obvious concern in any of our parks. And I was sitting at an event the other day, and the ranger came right up and grabbed the bottle from somebody, very politely said, this isn't allowed, explained the thing, and then took the bottle and disposed of it. So we are very serious about no bottles in our parks. And so that's, we will see. We haven't any indication, and part of it is our current events. We do have current events that have alcohol and have not, with the exception of one notable exception, had any concerns about alcohol and marijuana it's not allowed under our alcohol permits, and so we don't anticipate any additional problems around marijuana.
Maybe something you may want to look at in the evaluation, just possible too. So thank you for setting it up this way. I think, obviously our residents support it, and it's just always the unintended consequences you have to watch out for. So
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilman Clark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to echo appreciation of the one-year trial. I think there is a lot of fear of what this could lead to, and so knowing that there's going to be a close check on that, I think will be appreciated. On the survey results, I think you must have used zip codes to break some of this stuff out. It's an interesting way to look at Wash Park because it's different than how we normally look at Wash Park, which is statistically and council district-wise, it's west versus east, and you have it north versus south. If it's possible if you have that stat, I'd love to see it west versus east.
We just have zip code,
You
so
just have
that's
zip-
why it's just approximate.
okay,
We do
all
not
right.
do neighborhood.
Okay, I was like north and south. I haven't seen it like that
Yeah.
before. And then it sounds like we have moved since June 4th, but I got a lot of phone calls after the Denverite article. It looks like we'll probably have a follow-up to that article coming up. But I just want to clarify on the record here, because in that, the quote is, unless Denver City Council brings forward a proposal that they allow beer in parks or somehow a rule is made for City and County of Denver, we would be following a no beer, no alcohol whatsoever. And this is just in relation to the, the
Public
public
consumption.
consumption. It sounds like that is not the case anymore, that we are allowing full-strength beer and wine under this policy with no action from City Council. But I just want to clarify, because that's what I got a lot of
That is what
questions
is being proposed, so that all of the policy is in one place.
Okay, and so there will, on all of this, there's no city council action. There doesn't need to be city council action to change that to allow full-strength beer and wine for public consumption.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Brooks.
I don't have too much to add. My questions were answered. I represent City Park, and Jazz in the Park is the event that I have been for 7 years saying, please, can we modernize our rules? And so you guys are doing it, and I'm so grateful. And I think a lot of people adhere to. I have seen some bottles, but most folks do wine in the box. And so I just appreciate you guys modernizing this, and I know my constituents are appreciative, and I haven't had many who have reached out with any concerns, but more appreciation, so thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Espinoza.
Yeah, I'm curious why you conflated the two things of consumption in parks with permitted events in parks. Because we could have adopted a rule change just to address consumption, whereby full-strength beer and wine is acceptable without getting into this whole business of numbers of permitted events, use of alcohol in all parks and all this other stuff. So why do that?
Well, thank you, Councilman, for the question. It really wasn't the change in state law that prompted the entire thing. It really was inconsistencies and I think complicated event permit policy that drove our thinking about changing this. As I mentioned earlier, we were getting requests that we constantly required us to look at making exceptions to the policy. And so that is what prompted us to look at the entire policy, that, well, what's the difference between this event and that event? I'm doing this, how is that different than that? And the rules were different in each of those instances. And so we realized that it maybe made sense to take a look at the whole process of permits for events, various different kinds of events.
And did it get into granular things? Because, I mean, are we now going to allow alcohol sale in the parking lot at Red Rocks and nightly alcohol sale at Levitt Pavilion in Ruby Hill? I mean, there are differences. One of my frustrations about this sort of one-size-fits-all is we've learned through the zoning code, treating the entire city and its unique attributes, with the same policy will have unintended consequences.
Good question, because I think there are differences. And as I think Fred mentioned earlier, we make those distinctions generally based on the actual event permit, which are fit to the size of the park, the type of event, and alcohol is just an added element of a special event. But if there are particular circumstances from one park to the next for any kind of an event, that would be managed through the conditions and the requirements under the actual event permit.
So if we're deferring to E&L on the actual alcohol permit, it's once they have the alcohol sales permit, then you start tweaking the rules, or are you going to preemptively presuppose that somebody's permit is going to have beer and alcohol sales with it, or how are you?
So let me we probably, Chris is here. Come back up to the table, Chris. So they would have to go get their alcohol license, but that license is required if they're proposing to serve alcohol. They have to get that before we finalize their permits, and so it is a part of the overall sort of basket of activities that we look at when we issue the final permit.
So currently, right now,
So
certain
so an
events.
E&L essentially doesn't get the last word. We get the last word in terms of the overall event permit.
And that's crucial.
Maybe Chris can walk you through kind of how that process would work.
Would you like me to do that?
Just a second, because I think this part you'll be able to address this as well. Because right now, there's certain limits on premises. There's a boundary where there's an ID check and whatnot. Are we proposing getting rid of that? Would E&L allow that, or is that a function of E&L, or is that a function of parks, or is it?
Well, it's sort of both. We will determine, we may and do restrict where alcohol sales can occur in the park. But state law requires the licensed premises to be defined and contained, controlled. That's, I believe their word. That stays in place. So the excise and license, when you go, if somebody goes to excise and license to get a liquor license, they must define the licensed premises, and they must show how they will contain it and control it. That stays in place, and as Happy said, we get the final say of, okay, you want your licensed premises to be there? No, we don't want it there. We can put it, you need to have it, you want your beer garden here? No, we want it over here.
And
And that is
when they
still a
go to
requirement.
get their license, they had to have gotten permission from us about where
Yes.
those premises can be, because excise and license won't issue them a license unless they've had some indication that, yes, you can be in this spot. So we dictate where in the parks that activity can occur. And on top of whatever restrictions or requirements that excise and license puts on them, we can add to that. So, for example, Fred mentioned the tip certified service. that may be some additional requirements that we add on top of what excise and license may require. And
And so that's probably why you're assuming there's not going to be a dramatic increases, because it's already a little bit onerous. This just expands the sort of menu for existing operations, but to leap into that business is going to be.
it's not going to be easy.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of hoops to go through, and you need to know what you're doing.
Okay. But can you advertise alcohol-friendly events? I mean, now that people can bring their own in, if Jefferson Park has 2 concerts, family-oriented concerts a year that are free, can private people attending those events now, I think, could bring whatever alcohol they would like, provided in the consumption rules.
Beer and wine.
Well, okay, sorry.
Right, and,
Or their own
which I
We
think is a
can do a
very important
premix.
distinction.
And assuming that they haven't gotten, because if they get an alcohol permit, then individual consumption is not allowed.
You can't bring it in.
You can't do
But
both
we'd have to control the perimeter of the park at that point?
Can't bring it in.
Correct.
Okay,
of the licensed premise.
great.
I'm wondering if you could yield the floor so we have one
Absolutely.
person who hasn't asked a question and then come back to it.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Councilman Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Happy, I have to tell you, all the times I've sat in this room and elsewhere and seen agencies come forward with programs and policy changes, this is by far, I think, the best structure that I've seen. And I want to thank you for that. The pilot, the 1-year sunset, forcing a reevaluation, I think it addresses a lot of the concerns that were in the community, and I think it'll be well received. And, I think it's a testament to how you're willing to work with the community to do that. So thank you very much. I just had.
Thank you. Great thanks to Fred and Laura
Yes.
and Chris particularly.
I just had one request and one observation. The observation is, Fred, when you mentioned that we're changing the policies, that we're going to say that we'll follow what state law is, I have found in the past in other contexts that it is not necessarily a good idea to allow what we do in our home rule city to have a provision that says we'll follow whatever state law is, because the next session comes down the pike, we could find ourselves suddenly having to enforce something we don't really want. So that might be something we'd want to revisit here.
Just as a point
Yes.
of clarification, if I may.
Yes.
That was the original proposal before we knew what state law was.
Right.
And so it was also, by the way, state law or city law.
Right.
That what
Okay.
we proposed, but that's now out the window because we know what state law is, which is passing it to.
So we can be nimble enough if the legislature does something, we can still have our own policy.
Yeah.
But, okay.
Although there were, at the time, state law is what dictated what alcohol
Right.
policy is.
Yes,
And so,
right.
we had to follow
Exactly.
what they were doing. And
We
and
didn't know
in-
what they
In
were
this
gonna do.
instance, they were wise enough to say, you guys need to figure it out on your own.
Good, good. That's rare.
Yes.
And the request, Laura, was to follow up on Councilman Clark. Can we have the sliced and diced data from the survey based on zip code? I'm interested in the zip codes in my district. If I email them to you, can you send me just those results?
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you. That's all.
Okay, and then we had Councilman New, and then we'll go back.
Real quick, just on process, just make sure I understood. Would they go to get the park permit first and then go to excise and license? And would excise and license, is that good for all year, or is it just event-specific?
And they can only use the 30
Go ahead.
days, right?
If you want me to, I'll address the last part, and then Chris will go through the process. A special event liquor license can only be pulled by a nonprofit organization, and it is limited to
30 days or less.
30 days in a calendar year.
Right, that's right.
So,
And when they get a license, it's specific to the dates that they request. So they don't get a blanket, you can go sell, in whatever for 30 days. 30 days is just the limit, and that is within a year's period of time.
I see. And so if they came with a permit description that says the parking lot at Red Rocks, a red flag would go up or something, I mean, that wouldn't happen probably, but if there was something that was inappropriate, that somebody tried to fraudulently do something, with the
That-
description.
Yeah, they would correct that. I will point out that the Red Rocks facilities, the parking lots and the other are under the jurisdiction of arts and venues, so we don't control those.
I just
But
used that as
yes,
an example of
the
just-
answer generally to your question is yes.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you.
Councilman Espinoza, did you have others?
I had one more, but I
and excuse me for interrupting. Why can't you bring your own beer and wine if there is a permit for selling of liquor? It sounds like protectionism for the concession.
State liquor law. And that's a simple
Oh.
answer. You cannot, if you have if you can't bring your own drink into a bar,
You can't walk.
you can't.
Well, I know, but that's protectionism for the bar, but for a park,
It's liquor
It's under
license.
the permit. If there's a permit or a license, then that's all that's allowed is that particular.
I know, but it seems crazy in a park context. Yeah?
Having worked for a nonprofit that had events in parks, you're responsible for how intoxicated people are and stopping to serve them. And if someone is in with their own bottle and they're drinking,
Oh, that
you're
makes
still
sense.
responsible on your permit and your liquor license for
Oh, that
them,
makes-
and you can't control that.
That makes sense. Okay, thanks.
Councilman New, just real quick, thank you for the question. The process is very simple. We talk to excise and license regularly, and so a permit applicant has to take their preliminary permit, which is not their approved permit from us, that shows proof of property, and that they are allowed to have alcohol in said spaces, and they have to present that to excise and license as part of their application packet. And I would say I talk to excise and license maybe once every 2 weeks. If something looks squirrely to them, or they're not quite sure, they'll call and double check with us.
Great. Well, that's good. It's not a lot more work for them. It just sounds like it's very tightly controlled, so thank you very much.
We are at the end of our committee, but as we have done in the past, we still have questions. And so if y'all can stick around, we'll keep going. And if Channel 8 has to say goodbye, that's fine. And so I will adjourn this meeting, actually, and go ahead with your question.
So is there any way to limit the expansion to Denver-based license holders? Because these are Denver parks that are paid for and used by Denver residents, that the benefactor of these relaxed rules would be Denver-based businesses?
Councilman, we don't have any Denver residency requirements on any of our event permits, and so we wouldn't be proposing to do that even in this instance.
Yeah, I
It'd be
wish we
very
had,
difficult to manage or to enforce.
because I'm more worried about the expansion.
Liquor permit, could you get an alcohol permit?
What was your
Excise
question?
and license, so somebody from Aurora can come and get a permit?
Sure.
Okay.
All right? All right. Thanks very much,
Thank
guys.
you all.
Thanks for
Thank
bringing
you.
this to us.